Maniac Magee, Chapter 9. John McNabb had never in his life met a kid who he couldn't strike out, until the run. Now, as he thought about it, he came to two conclusions. One, he couldn't stand having this blemish on his record. Two, if you beat a kid up, it's the same as striking him out. So McNabb and his pals went looking for the kid. They called themselves the Cobras. Nobody messed with them, at least nobody in the West End. The Cobras had heard that the kid hung around the park and the tracks, and that's where they spotted him one Saturday afternoon, on the tracks by the path that ran from the Oriole Street dead end to the park. He was down by Red Hill and heading away from them, book in hand, as usual. But the Cobras just stood there, stunned. "I don't believe it," one Cobra said. "Must be a trick," said another. "I heard about it," said another, "but I didn't believe it." It wasn't a trick, it was true. The kid was running on the rail. McNabb scooped up a handful of track stones. He launched one. He snarled. "He's dead. Let's get him." By the time Maniac looked back, they were almost on him. He wobbled once, leaped from the rail to the ground, and took off. He was at the Oriole Street dead end, but his instincts said no, not the street, too much open space. He stuck with the tracks. Coming into view above him was the house on Rake Hill, where he had eaten spaghetti. He could go there, to the whistling mother, the other kids, be safe. They wouldn't follow him in there, would they? Stones clanked off the street rails. He darted left, skirted the dump, wove through the miniature mountain range of stone piles and into the streets, skiing on his heels down the steep bank and into the creek, frogs plopping, no time to look for stepping rocks. Yells behind him now, were whoops, stones pelting the water, stinging his back. The other side, through the trees and picker bushes, past the armory jeeps and out to the park boulevard, past the Italian restaurant on the corner, the bakery, screeching tires, row houses, streets, alleys, cars, porches, windows, faces staring, faces, the town whizzing past. Maniac, a blur of faces, each face staring from its own window, each face in its own personal frame, its own house, its own address, some place to be when there was no other place to be. How lucky to be a face staring out from a window. And then, could it be? The voices behind him were growing faint. He slowed, turned, stopped. They were lined up at a street a block back. They were still yelling and shaking their fists, but they weren't moving off the curb. And now they were laughing. Why were they laughing? The Cobras were standing at Hector Street. Hector Street was the boundary between the east and west ends. Or to put it another way, between the blacks and whites. Not that you never saw a white in the east end or a black in the west end. People did cross the line now and then, especially if they were adults and it was daylight. But nighttime, forget it. And if you were a kid, day or night, forget it. Unless you had business on the other side, such as a sports team or school, don't be strolling along. Don't be just strolling along as if you belong there, as if you weren't afraid, as if you didn't even notice you were a different color from everybody around you. The Cobras were laughing because they figured the dumb, scraggly runt would get out of the East End in about as good shape as a bare big toe in a convention of snapping turtles. Chapter 10. Of course, Maniac didn't know any of that. He was simply glad the chase was over. He turned and started walking, catching his breath. East Chestnut, East Marshall, Green Street, Arch Street. He had been around here before. That first day with the girl named Amanda, other days jogging through, but this was Saturday, not a school day, and there was something different about the streets. Kids, all over. One of them jumped down from a front step and planted himself right in front of Maniac. Maniac had to jerk to a stop to keep from plowing into the kid. Even so, their noses were practically touching. Maniac blinked and stepped back. The kid stepped forward. Each time Maniac stepped back, the kid stepped forward. They traveled practically half a block that way. Finally, Maniac turned and started walking. The kid jumped around and plunked himself in front again. He bit off a chunk of the candy bar he was holding. "Where you going?" he said. Candy bar flakes flew from his mouth. "I'm looking for Sycamore Street," said Maniac. "Do you know where it is?" "Yeah, I know where it is." Maniac waited, but the kid said nothing more. Well, do you think you could tell me where it is? Stone was softer than the kid's glare. No. Maniac looked around. Other kids had stopped playing, were staring. Someone called, "Doing Mars." Someone else, "Wasting 'em." The kid, as you probably guessed by now, was none other than Mars Bar Thompson. Mars Bar heard the calls, and the stone got harder. Then suddenly he stopped glaring. Suddenly he was smiling. He held up the candy bar an inch from Maniac's lips. "Want a bite?" Maniac couldn't figure. "You sure?" "Yeah, go ahead, take a bite." Maniac shrugged, took the Mars bar, bit off a chunk, and handed it back. "Thanks." Dead silence along the street. The kid had done the unthinkable. He had chomped on one of Mars's own bars. Not only that, but white kids just didn't put their mouths where black kids had had theirs, be it soda bottles, spoons, or candy bars. And the kid hadn't even gone for the unused end. He had chomped right over Mars Bar's own bite marks. Mars Bar was confused. Who was this kid? What was this kid? As usual, when Mars Bar got confused, he got mad. He thumped Maniac in the chest. "You think you bad or something?" Maniac, who was now twice as confused as Mars Bar, blinked. "Huh? You think you come down here and be bad? That what you think?" Mars Bar was practically shouting now. "No," said Maniac, "I don't think I'm bad. I'm not saying I'm an angel either. Not even real good. Somewhere in between, I guess." Mars Bar jammed his arms downward and stuck out his chin, sneered, "Am I bad?" Maniac was befuddled. "I don't know. One minute you're yelling at me, the next minute you're giving me a bite of your candy bar." The chin jutted out more. "Tell me I'm bad." Maniac didn't answer. Flies stopped buzzing. "I said, tell me I'm bad." Maniac blinked, shrugged, sighed. "It's none of my business. If you're bad, let your mother or father tell you." Now it was Mars Bar doing the blinking, stepping back, trying to sort things out. After a while, he looked down. "What's that?" Before Maniac answered, "A book." Mars Bar had snatched it from his hand. "This ain't yours," he said. He flipped through some pages. "Looks like mine." "It's somebody else's." "It's mine. I'm keeping it." With rattlesnake speed, Maniac snatched the book back, except for one page, which stayed, tipped, in Mars Bar's hand. "Give me the page," said Maniac. Mars Bar grinned. "Take it, Fishbelly." Silence. Eyes. The flies were waiting. East End vultures. Suddenly, neither could see the other, because a broom came down like a straw curtain between their faces, and a voice said, "I'll take it." It was the lady from the nearest house, out to sweep her steps. She lowered the broom, but kept it between them. "Better yet," she said to Mars Bar, "just give it back to him." Mars Bar glared up at her. There wasn't an 11-year-old in the East End who could stand up to Mars Bar's glare. In the West End, even high schoolers were known to crumble under the glare. Two old ladies on both sides of Hector Street, it was all but fatal. When Mars Bar stepped off a curb and combined the glare with his super slow dip stride Siamp shuffle, well, it was said he could back up traffic all the way to Bridgeport while he took 10 minutes to cross the street. But not this time. This time, Mars Bar was up against an East End lady in her prime, and she was matching him eyeball for eyeball. And when it was over, only one glare was left standing, and it wasn't Mars Bar's. Mars Bar's handed back the torn page, but not before he crumpled it into a ball. The broom pushed him away, turned him around, and swept him up the street. The lady looked down at Maniac. A little of the glare lingered in her eyes. "You better get on, boy, where you belong. I can't be following you around. I got things to do." Maniac just stood there a minute. There was something he felt like doing, and maybe he would have, but the lady turned and went back inside her house and shut the door. So he walked away. Chapter 11. Now what? Maniac uncrumpled the page, flattened it out as best he could, How could he return the book to Amanda in this condition? He couldn't, but he had to. It was hers. Judging from that morning, she was pretty finicky about her books. What would make her madder? To not get the book back at all, or to get it back with a page ripped out? Maniac cringed at both prospects. He wandered around the East End, jogging slowly, in no hurry now to find 728 Sycamore Street. He was passing a vacant lot when he heard an all too familiar voice. "Hey, Fishbelly." He stopped, turned. This time, Mars Bar wasn't alone. A handful of other kids trailed him down the sidewalk. Maniac waited. Coming up to him, Mars Bar said, "Where you running, boy?" "Nowhere." "You running from us? You afraid?" "No, I just like to run." "You want to run?" Mars Bar grinned. "Go ahead. We'll give you a head start." Maniac grinned back. "No, thanks." Mars Bar held out his hand. "Give me my book." Maniac shook his head. Mars Bar glared. "Gimme it." Maniac shook his head. Mars Bar reached for it. Maniac pulled it away. They moved in on him now. They backed him up. Some high schoolers were playing basketball up the street, but they weren't noticing. And there wasn't a broom swinging lady in sight. Maniac felt a hard flatness against his back. Suddenly, his word was very small and very simple. A brick wall behind him, a row of scowling faces in front of him. He clutched the book with both hands. The faces were closing in. A voice called, "That you, Jeffrey?" The faces parted. At the curb was a girl on a bike. Amanda. She hoisted the bike to the sidewalk and walked it over. She looked at the book, at the torn page. "Who ripped my book?" Mars Bar pointed at Maniac. "He did." Amanda knew better. "You ripped my book." Mars Bar's eyes went big as headlights. "I did not." "You did. You lie." "I didn't." "You did." She let the bike fall to Maniac. She grabbed the book and started kicking Mars Bar in his beloved sneakers. "I got a little brother and a little sister that crayon all over my books, and I got a dog that eats them and poops on them, and that's just inside my own family. And I'm not going to have nobody else messing with my books. You understand?" By then, Mars Bar was hauling up the street past the basketball players, who were rolling on the asphalt with laughter. Amanda took the torn page from Maniac. To her, it was the broken wing of a bird, a pet out in the rain. She turned misty eyes to Maniac. "It's one of my favorite pages." Maniac smiled. "We can fix it." The way he said it, she believed. "Want to come to my house?" she said. "Sure," he said. Chapter 12. When they walked in, Amanda's mother was busy with her usual tools, a yellow plastic bucket and a sponge. She was scrubbing purple crayon off the TV screen. "Mom," said Amanda, "this is Jeffrey." She whispered, "What's your last name?" He whispered, "Magee." She said, "Magee." Mrs. Beale held up a hand, said, "Hold it," and went on scrubbing. When she finally finished, she straightened up, turned, and said, "Now what?" "Mom, this is Jeffrey Magee. You know?" Amanda was hardly finished when Maniac zipped across the room and stuck out his hand. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Beale." Mrs. Beale. They shook hands. Mrs. Beale smiled. "So you're the book boy." She started nodding. Amanda came home one day. "Mom, there's a boy I loaned one of my books out to." "Loaned a book?" "Yes." "Mom, he practically made me. He really likes books. I met him on—" "Mom," Amanda screeched, "I never said all that." Mrs. Beale nodded solemnly. "No, of course you didn't," and gave Maniac a huge wink, which made Amanda screech louder until something crashed in the kitchen. Mrs. Beale ran. Amanda and Maniac ran. The scene in the kitchen stopped them cold. One little girl, eyes wide, standing on a countertop. One little boy, eyes wide, standing just below her on a chair. One shattered glass jar and some stringy pale colored glop on the floor. One growing cloud of sauerkraut fumes. The girl was Hester, age 4. The boy was Lester, age 3. In less than 5 minutes, while Mrs. Beale and Amanda cleaned up the floor, Hester and Lester and their dog Bow Wow were in the backyard wrestling and tickling and lumping and jumping and just generally going wild with their new buddy and victim, Maniac Magee. Maniac was still there when Mr. Beale came home from his Saturday shift at the tire factory. He was there for dinner when Hester and Lester pushed their chairs alongside his. He was there to help Amanda mend her torn book. He was there watching TV afterward, with Hester riding one knee, Lester the other. He was there when Hester and Lester came screaming down the stairs with a book, Amanda screaming even louder after them, the kids shoving the book and themselves onto Maniac's lap. Amanda finally calming down because they didn't want to cram the book. They only wanted Maniac to read. And so he read Lyle, Crocodile to Hester and Lester, and even though they pretended not to listen, to Amanda and Mr. and Mrs. Beale. And he was there when Hester and Lester were herded upstairs to bed. Mrs. Beale said, "Don't you think it's about time you're heading home, Jeffrey? Your parents will be wondering. So Maniac, wanting to say something but not knowing how, got into the car for Mr. Beale to drive him home. And then he made his mistake. He waited for only 2 or 3 blocks to go by before saying to Mr. Beale, "This is it." Mr. Beale stopped, but he didn't let Maniac out of the car. He looked at him funny. Mr. Beale knew what his passenger apparently didn't. East End was East End, and West End was West End. And the house this white lad was pointing to was filled with black people just like every other house on up to Hector Street. Mr. Beale pointed this out to Maniac. Maniac's lips started to quiver, and right there, with the car idling in the middle of the street, Maniac told him that he didn't really have a home, unless you counted the deer shed at the zoo. Mr. Beale made a U-turn right there and headed back. Only Mrs. Beale was still downstairs when they walked into the house. She listened to no more than 10 seconds worth of Mr. Beale's explanation before saying to Maniac, "You're staying here." Not long after, Maniac was lying in Amanda's bed, Amanda having been carried over to Hester and Lester's room, where she often slept anyway. Before Maniac could go to sleep, however, there was something he had to do. He flipped off the covers and went downstairs. Before the puzzled faces of Mr. and Mrs. Beale, he opened the front door and looked at the 3 cast iron digits nailed to the door frame. 728. He kept staring at them, smiling. Then he closed the door, said a cheerful goodnight, and went back to bed. Maniac Magee finally had an address.